Awesome. Yeah, thanks so much, Nathan. Really happy to be here. Obviously, I'm familiar with Data Science Dojo. Good stuff, good webinars. And so really honored to be kind of part of that. In this talk, though, it's going to last probably about a half hour or so. If there's questions in the meantime, it might last a little longer. I hope there are. Please, as Nathan said, do jump in if you do have questions along the way. And as Nathan said, I'm going to talk about the 7 ingredients. I'm going to call ingredients in every great chart. And as you'll see, I think this is kind of a necessary talk because a lot of charts are not great. I know it's going to be a shocker to a lot of people, but I'm going to kind of sort of start peeling that onion and figure out, like, well, essentially why? Like, what are the missing ingredients that cause charts to fail? Just very briefly, because you didn't come here to hear about me, but just a few seconds about my background. So as Nathan said, I'm an educator. So I do corporate training and with for universities and all sorts of different private, public organization governments. Pre-COVID, I was traveling a lot. I've taught in over a dozen countries. You can see some of my clients on the side here. There are many others. Pretty wide variety, right? Aerospace, government, banking, insurance, kind of all over the map. I don't do a lot of consulting anymore, but I have designed dashboards for a lot of organizations. But this talk is really about data visualization specifically. I have a software background, but I don't teach people about software. I teach sort of higher level general principles, which again is actually, I'm going to kind of touch on that during the talk. Working on 2 books right now. The practical charts will come out hopefully by the end of this year, and then practical dashboards next year. So yeah, why? Why did I feel that this talk was necessary? Well, as I mentioned, a lot of charts fail, right? What exactly do I mean by that? Well, things like they leave audiences just wondering, like, what was the point? Like, okay, I get it. I understand this chart, but, is there like some kind of problem that I'm supposed to notice? Is there some key takeaway? Is there a recommendation here? Or just confused, right? They don't understand exactly what data they're looking at. And of course, the worst of all is misled, where they come away with a fundamentally wrong understanding of the data and the reality that data is supposed to represent. This happens a lot more than people tend to realize. And so I think the main reason why this is sort of, the current state of affairs is that a lot of people, including people who both consume charts and people who create them, simply underestimate the amount of skill and knowledge, or what I'm calling kind of ingredients, that are necessary to create good charts, right? Most of us, most of the people I talk to anyways, well, they assume that really there's only kind of 2 ingredients that are necessary. The first is you have to know how to use a piece of data visualization software like Excel or Tableau or Click or Power BI or Jump, lots of them out there, of course. And you have to know what kind of data you're visualizing, right? Is it time series data? Is it the breakdown of a total? Is it data that's associated with locations? And as long as we have these 2 kind of ingredients, we can make great charts. And so I'm going to try to sort of dissuade you of that and convince you that there are, in fact, at least 5 other major sort of ingredients, as I'm calling them, that are necessary in order to create great charts. You actually need all of these things. And so I'm going to kind of step through and talk briefly about each one. So let's start with the obvious one, right? This is the one that most people kind of associate with data visualization skill, is data visualization software expertise, right? Knowing how to use one or more of these products very effectively. And obviously, it's necessary, right? You have to know how to use at least one of these pieces of software in order to create charts, whether good or bad. But it's certainly not sufficient, right? For example, if we say something like, well, being an expert user of Microsoft Excel means that you're good at creating charts, that's kind of like saying, well, if you're an expert user of Microsoft Word, well, that makes you a great writer. It's like, no. Like, that's clearly not how it works, right? There are all sorts of kind of higher level skills that you have to know and that the software will not help you with in order to be a great writer. And it's very much the same thing with charts, right? Just being, an expert guru user of a software application does not mean that you know how to make great charts. And unfortunately, I see this all the time. People who are very good at using these software packages produce charts that are, confusing, misleading, all these things. And so you need these kind of higher level skills. And so this is definitely, not equal. So it's necessary, but it's not sufficient, essentially. But there's a lot of focus that's put on this to the point where a lot of even job ads that I see that advertise for data visualization roles, really all they talk about are software skills, right? And they assume that if you're very good at using a piece of software, you'll be able to create great charts. The other kind of ingredient that most people sort of recognize is just knowing what kind of data you're trying to visualize. It's necessary in order to create a good chart, right? For example, if our data looks like this, well, the nature of this data is the breakdown of a total over time, right? So we're a charity, I guess. We have donations, and the total donations for 12 months here broken down by region, right? Breakdown of total over time. There are all sorts of chart types out there. In the course that I teach, we talk about over 50 of them. Here's kind of a sampling. And yeah, based on the nature of the data, we can definitely eliminate some of these choices, right? And say, oh yeah, we're not going to be using, a tree map or a strip plot, for example, to visualize this information. But you'll notice if you look closely, there's a lot of options there that are left, right, that remain. And so, for example, we could visualize this data like this, right? Just kind of as a standard line chart, or like this standard line chart with a total line added, or like this as a stacked area chart, or like this as a stacked bar chart, or like this as a 100% stacked bar chart, or like this as this was a 100% stacked area chart. This is a 100% stacked bar chart. And so, based on the data alone, we can't make all of our design decisions because all these design decisions are potentially kind of, viable options. And this is always the case, right? Whenever we have a data set, there's always lots of ways that we could visualize it, even though the nature of the data itself is the same. And so just knowing the nature of the data essentially just kind of rounds down our choices, but there's always lots of choices left, right? It doesn't give us specific design decision or design choices. Like, it doesn't tell exactly which chart type to use. It just narrows down our choices, which kind of begs the question, right? Well, then how would we decide which one of these design choices to use for this data? Well, that's where the third ingredient comes in, which is what you need to say about the data, right? This is kind of a very common misconception that people have, is they think, when we're creating a chart, we're trying to find the overall best way of visualizing the data, but that's not enough. You also have to know what you're trying to say about the data. For example, this would be a good option if the insight that we were trying to communicate was that the East region here is now our top region at over 20K, right? Well, this would be the best way of saying that. But this would be a good choice if we have had a different insight. Like, for example, we want to say that total donations, decreased near the end of the year, and the East is now our top region. Well, yeah, this would be the best way of communicating that. Or this could be the best choice too, right? If we want to say something like, well, total donations decreased towards the end of the year, and the West now accounts for a much smaller fraction of overall donations. So the orange part here got much smaller. Well, stacked area chart would be the best way of communicating that. And, again, for all of these other options, these are all the best choice for different insights and answers that we might want to communicate about the data, right? And so, this is something that a lot of people don't understand, is that designing a chart without knowing specifically what insight or what answer we're trying to communicate about the data, it's like designing a building without knowing what it's for, right? Is it going to be condos or a hospital or a warehouse or a hotel? Because obviously the purpose of the building is going to influence its design significantly, right? And a lot of people just think, oh, I look at the data and I figure out the best way to visualize the data without ever thinking about what am I trying to say about the data. But as we just saw, if you haven't figured out what you're trying to say about the data, well, essentially, your design choices are going to be random, right? You're going to just pick a chart type. You're going to pick a color palette, essentially based on, a random guess. And so our chart is probably not going to be very effective in that kind of situation, right? And so, yeah, this is critically important as an essential ingredient into a great chart is figuring out beforehand, what are we trying to say about the data? But people often skip that step. Oh, Nathan, looks like we have a question.
Yes, it looks like this is from Matthias. Agreeing with what you're saying, but what if the stakeholder can't tell you or tells you that it shall be an explorative dashboard?
Yeah. So great question. This happens all the time. And I have a strategy that I recommend in my workshops that I call spray and pray, because essentially, we're in the realm of educated guesses at that point, right? If we can't figure out, exactly why the audience wants to see this data, well, then we're going to have to basically make some educated guesses. The mistake that people make, though, often is that they'll make one guess, right? They show one chart and they hope that that's going to be useful to the audience, but don't restrict yourself to that. Show them 3, maybe even 4, if you can get away with it. Different views of the same data, but then answer different questions and make different insights obvious. And then your odds are better, right? There's, that maybe at least one of them is, the reader's gonna be like, oh yeah, that one. That's the thing that I needed to know. That answers the question that I had. And so spray and pray is basically say, okay, we're going to give you an array of options and hope that one of them is going to be at least sort of somewhat useful to the audience. Good question. More to say about that, but I want to kind of respect the time limits here. The other question, of course, is how did I know that each one of these chart types was the best choice for these particular insights? And so that's where the 4th ingredient comes in, which is what I call the spelling and grammar of data visualization. And so these are skills like a chart type selection, right? Knowing how to choose a given chart type based on a variety of factors for a given situation, color palette choices, formatting legends and scales, annotations, all those good things. I call this kind of, like I said, spelling and grammar. And so for this particular design question, there are actual sort of spelling and grammar best practices that we can learn. So this is from one of the courses that I teach, which is basically a decision tree that will guide you to the appropriate chart type choice when we're trying to show the breakdown of a total over time. And because that was the situation we were in just a moment ago. There's lots of other best practices, of course, that fall into this kind of spelling and grammar category, things like even formatting scales effectively. This is not a well-designed quantitative scale, but this is, right? And again, there are formatting best practices that we can learn that will help us figure out, how to design effective quantitative scales. Color, of course, lots of best practices around that. This is not a good color choice palette for this situation. If you look closely, basically what we're looking at is this is sort of, financial information. I guess we're like a kind of a money management company, and we have 3 investment portfolios, and we're showing the breakdown of our portfolios by, essentially the riskiness of the various asset classes in it. So very high risk to moderate to very low risk. Is anything obvious from this though? Not really, right? And even if I point out a particular insight, right? Well, the aggressive portfolio contains more high risk assets. Does this kind of jump out at you from the sort of visual elements here? Not really, right? Well, what if we change the colors? Oh, well, yeah. I mean, even before I've read any of the text, I already see that this has a lot more of something, right? Whatever this thing is, it's got more of whatever. And then I start reading the text and I it kind of fills in the gaps. Oh, I see. The more in this case is essentially higher risk, right? More risk. Not at all obvious here, right? And so again, there's lots of other best practices, spelling and grammar best practices that we can learn about color. This is, again, from one of the courses that I teach, talks about all sorts of other important things to know when we're choosing colors. And there are actually lots of other spelling and grammar kind of best practices. In the course that I teach, it's 14 hours long. There's a lot to learn. There's about 25 of those, what I call cheat sheets in there. And so it's not something that you can just sort of pick up in a couple of hours. It does take a bit of time. It's not rocket science, though. It's generally pretty easy to learn. So we were up to 4, as you saw. I have 7 ingredients. What is the next one? Well, it's knowledge of the audience and the domain that the data came from. And so I want to make this, like, we talk about this all the time, right? Know your audience. It's like, you've probably already heard that, 100 times. Or I want to make it really kind of visceral for you, because even though most of us heard that before, most of us still don't actually really do it. So another scenario here, we are a retail chain. We have 4 stores, and we're an analyst for this chain, and we've made this discovery, right? We looked at the sales for the 4 stores recently, and it's like, whoa, clearly this is the important insight here. The sales at store B here are collapsing. And so you're pretty pleased with yourself. You discovered this important insight. You bring it to the next management team meeting, expecting lots of kudos and oohs and ahs. You show them your insight and you get shrugs, right? People are like, well, yeah, like, obviously we're shutting down store B, right? We're not replenishing its inventory. And so of course its sales are going down, right? Like, you have surprised no one in the room. But then, a moment later, one of the executives sort of pops up and says, hold on a second. We are also shutting down store C, right? And yet, look, its sales are actually chugging right along. Like, what's with that? We expected the sales of store C to collapse as well, and they're not. Wow, maybe, that's important. Maybe we should keep store C actually open. And so as it turned out, the important insight from this data was not this, it was this. And so how are you going to know that, right? I mean, you can stare at the data all day long. You can be the most talented, sophisticated data scientist in the world. But if you don't understand, the context of the data, what are the current sort of concerns and priorities of the audience, for example, well, you're going to be producing a lot of charts that are not very useful potentially, and you're going to be missing stuff that is potentially very useful. And so knowledge of the audience means things like knowing what the audience would expect or not expect, like what would they find, expected versus surprising. We just saw, that's really important. Knowing any specific concerns or priorities or questions that the audience has right now. What kinds of insights would be useful or useless to the audience? And again, you can stare at the data all day long. It's not going to tell us that. What background knowledge does the audience have? So we don't tell them things they already know. What are they lacking? All right, maybe that we thought they knew, but they actually didn't. What is their level of graphicacy, which is a real word? There's numeracy, literacy, and graphicacy. Graphicacy being, of course, the ability to read graphs. If we show charts that people are unfamiliar with, well, and they don't know how to read them, well, that's not going to be very useful. And I've seen lots of charts flop that way. And or are there ways that the audience is used to seeing data represented? Maybe the stores are always listed in a certain order or things like that. Well, we got to kind of know about that. And we won't get those answers from the data. We'll only get them from sitting in on meetings and really developing a good understanding of our audience. Also critically important to understand the context of the data or the domain. For example, if we are dealing with insurance data, we're creating charts about insurance, we got to know something about insurance. We got to know how insurance works. We don't have to be an insurance expert, but we have to have a pretty good understanding of that domain, or sports or healthcare or whatever kind of data you're dealing with. I've heard, fortunately, very often people say, oh, I'm such a great data analyst. I can work with data from any domain and find insights. It's like, yeah, I don't believe you, right? It's just simply not possible. Understanding what is kind of common knowledge in this domain. So again, we don't tell people things they already knew. or there are conventional ways of presenting data in this domain, maybe certain chart types, which are very sort of common in this domain, which are not in other domains. Really important to know. And of course, where does the data come from? How was it collected? Was it filtered beforehand? We have to understand, like I said, the context of the data. Getting there, right? Number 6 is some basic statistics. You don't have to be a statistician to create great charts, but you have to know essentially where the landmines are, what are the common statistical mistakes that people make, because otherwise we're going to plant those landmines in our charts. Again, let me sort of really make this sort of visceral for you with an example. So let's say we have some salary data from 3 companies, and we want to try and get an idea of how these companies compare to one another in terms of their salaries. The obvious way of doing this, of course, would be to calculate the average or the mean or the arithmetic mean of these salaries. And so we would just add up all the salaries in each company divided by the number of employees, and that gives us, of course, the average salary. And so we're fine with this, and we decide to visualize it. And really, of course, the key insight here is that essentially all these companies are very similar in terms of their salaries. But then some old guy with gray hair like me, he comes along and says, you know what? Let's try this other chart type just to see what the data looks like as a strip plot. And so here, each point, each dot is the salary of one of the employees in company A, and these are the companies or the employees in company B, employees in company C, and wow, these companies are not similar in terms of their salaries. Yeah, they have similar average salaries, but working in this company would be very different than working in this company, right? Or this one. Like here, we basically have 2 completely different groups. Like nobody makes close to the average. There's just one group that's well above average and one group that's well below. Very different than over here. And so, when you have sort of a basic grounding in statistics, you understand that it's actually quite dangerous to only look at averages without also looking at distributions, how the values are distributed. And there's tons of other, these kind of statistical landmines that I see showing up in charts all the time. And so, and it is a common reason why charts fail, right? Is that people show, means when they should be showing medians. They mistake correlation for causation, right? And there's a long list of these kind of mistakes that we can accidentally plant into charts, and then we end up essentially fundamentally misleading the audience. If you want to work on your basic statistical skills, if you feel this is something you need to maybe sort of fill in your skill set, I can recommend 2 books. There are many good ones, but Naked Statistics by Charles Wieland, great book, and The Data Loom by my colleague and friend, Stephen Few. Both of these are easy reads. Data Loom is like 150 pages, I think. And it equips you with enough to avoid sort of at least the most common landmines. And then finally, the final sort of ingredient is data cleansing and handling expertise, right? A lot of people on this call, I'm sure, are very familiar with the fact that this is something that you're going to be doing a fair amount of when you're creating charts. The data is rarely in a sort of a format that lends itself well to being visualized right away. Why is this important though? If we're simply responsible for creating charts, well, if we as the person who's creating charts are also the person who handled the data, well, we're going to have obviously a much better understanding of that context of the domain that I was talking about before, knowing like where did the data come from, how was it collected, how was it filtered, and this can often be incredibly important information that we then need to include in charts. We're also going to produce results a lot faster, right? If we don't have to wait on somebody else to query the data, to aggregate it, to cleanse it for us, we're just going to be able to turn things around faster. And that can often make a huge difference. As you all know, right, time is always of the essence. Most importantly, though, is that it's going to make us aware of any problems and limitations in the data, right? Most data is dirty. It's missing things. It's been aggregated in a kind of a bizarre way. It's been filtered. And so, and that's often absolutely essential information to include in the chart. Say this is, all transactions except for incomplete ones, right? Because those got filtered out. Oh, well, geez, if we didn't handle the data, we might not have known that. And then the audience would be, profoundly misled about the information they're looking at. So a couple of sort of final thoughts, right? Or more of a recap, I guess. What I want you to take away from this is that there's a surprisingly broad variety of skills and knowledge that are required to create good charts. Most people think that it's just those first two ingredients, right? I just have to know how to use a piece of software, and I have to know what kind of data I'm visualizing, and then I can create a good chart. No, that's the beginning, right? That's 2/7 of what you need. And just those kind of technical skills, right? Knowing how to use a software, knowing how to handle data are not enough, like very much not enough. Even if you have very strong kind of technical chops, if you're missing any one of those other types of skills, right? The ability to figure out like why you're showing the data to the audience, the ability to understand the priorities and concerns of the audience, lack of those sort of spelling and grammar skills, for example. If you're lacking any one of those, then you're probably creating some pretty bad charts pretty often. And so, as people who create charts, we have to develop all of these skills, right? None of them are optional. We actually need all 7. And even if we're missing just one, that's going to put our charts at risk of being not very good charts, essentially. So just some very final brief housekeeping. If you're interested in learning more about those sort of spelling and grammar skills that I mentioned, I think it was like ingredient number 3. I do public workshops a couple times a year. My next one is actually coming up in less than 2 weeks, I guess. Still a few spots left, not many, but obviously I'd be happy to see you there. Most of my time, though, is spent doing these private workshops for 15 to 30 people in the same organization. And actually here, I put up my contact information. If you have any questions about the talk, we can, of course, answer a few of them now. You can also reach out to me after the fact. If you wake up at 3 a.m. tonight and think, oh, I should have asked Nick about this, then you can absolutely reach me through any one of these ways as well. So do we have a lot of questions?
I think we will. Before we hit those, I am going to steal the screen from you, and I'm going to talk about next week's webinar, and then we will answer those questions.
Awesome. So let me stop my share.
All right. So next week we will have, and I'm really sorry if I butcher your name, but it's Serg Massis, and I think that's how you say it. I haven't had my call with him yet to go over how the webinar is going to be structured and everything. But Serg is he's a data scientist, specifically an agricultural data scientist at Syngenta. He's also the author of the best-selling book Interpretable. Gosh, I can't. It's Friday, so sorry. Interpretable machine learning with Python. But he's going to be giving us a hands-on introduction to machine learning models, where he's going to cover the importance of interpretation and explain various models and their classifications, including feature importance, feature summary, and local explanations. So if that's something that you're interested in, definitely join us next week, September 7th at noon Pacific time. So the same time as today, just on September 7th. And Nick, I'm going to have you reshare your screen now, because we did just get a question with how do we reach out to Nick if we have further questions. So if you could just share that last screen again, give everyone a good look at your contact information.
Yeah, certainly, yeah.
And then I also saw a question about will there be a link sent for the recording? Yes, we will. Likely, if you're on Zoom, that means you signed up through our website and we have your email address, and we will send you an email when the recording is live. If you're not on Zoom, we also post it all over our social media, so you can just follow us on LinkedIn, Facebook, Twitter, subscribe to our YouTube channel. It'll be there as well. And you'll be sure to see it. But yeah, it usually takes us a day to get the recording up and running. And with the Labor Day holiday on the 5th in the US, that will probably be Tuesday when the recording will be live. So now, so Nick, we do have one question. This was actually asked more towards the beginning, and I wanted to save it for the end. So this is from Alexander, and hopefully Alexander's still with us. Actually, I see him. You are still here. So large industrial businesses often want one procedure or standard chart that is used over and over again. What advice would you have for producing one single standard chart used for many years that can be relied upon to answer the same question, rather than starting with the insight or answer and finding the chart?
Yeah, I guess I'm not quite sure how exactly to interpret it. It sounds a little bit like the kind of, how do I create a chart when I don't know why I'm creating the chart kind of question that we had earlier. So maybe it was asked kind of before that question. And so, yeah, if that was kind of the nature of the question, essentially, I mean, or maybe it might be sort of a version of that question, which is essentially, how do I create a chart which makes like all possible insights, obvious, and answers all possible questions that people might have about the data, right? And unfortunately, those charts don't exist, right? That's kind of one of the harsh realities of data viz that a lot of people don't understand, which is essentially, charts don't show the data. They say a few things about the data. That's all they can do, right? If we start trying to create charts that answer like a ton of different types of questions or make a ton of different kinds of insights obvious, then we end up with what I call spaghetti charts, which essentially are charts with like, 3 different axes and, a legend that has like, 7 different symbols in it and 15 colors, because we have, like a budget versus last year as a percentage change and as a dollar change, and, a deviation from the target, right? We try and sort of mash all that together into this, sort of one chart to rule them all. Those don't work, right? And you do see them. Like, I do see them in practice, and people are just like, whoa, too much. And so you do have to make hard decisions. And often, not often, but like fairly often anyways, we're making educated guesses about like, well, okay, if we don't have a specific question that we're trying to answer, or a specific insight we're trying to communicate, you got to kind of pick one, right? And if you're really unsure, then you pick 2 or 3. And you create charts that answer those, or that make those insights obvious, and hope that one of them is going to be useful. Because a lot of people come into my workshops with that assumption, right? It's like, well, we're going to learn how to visualize the data, right? Show the data. It's like, no, we're going to learn how to basically say a couple of things about the data, because that's all we can ever do. Yeah.
Okay. So, and I'm seeing some questions being posted in chat. If you can, I'm going to try and make sure I get to all of these, but if you can post your question in the Q&A tab, that just helps me stay organized. And I'm not sure when this question actually, I do know this was asked right as you ended the webinar, but what about objectivity versus editorializing?
Great question. So, yeah, there's, I just wrote an article about this a couple of months ago. That's another thing that people often come into my workshops thinking is we're going to learn how to create neutral charts, right? That have no sort of interpretation on the part of the author. Again, that'd be awesome, right? If it were possible. But the thing is, it's not, right? It's kind of actually sort of a similar idea to what I was just talking about before, but kind of looked at from another angle. Like we can't create charts that just show the data, right? We always have to essentially have some kind of insight or answer to a question in mind. Otherwise, our design choices are just random guesses, essentially. And so, certainly my own view is like, because we have to have at least a theoretical idea of why we're creating the chart in the first place, then we might as well just tell the audience, right? This is why I'm showing you this information. Now, they might disagree with it, right? They might come back and say, oh, well, I have a different interpretation of this data, or I think we should respond differently. And that's fine. Then you talk about it, you learn from them in terms of, what is their world? What does it look like? Why do they think that was important? But, this idea that we can somehow present a, sort of quote unquote bias free or neutral chart is unfortunately impossible, right? Sometimes people will say, well, what about tables, right? Tables are neutral, right? Tables don't say anything about the data. And in a sense, that's true, but it's also kind of a problem. It's like, yeah, they don't say anything about the data, which is why people often get tables and are like, because it's just too much work to figure out, like, what am I supposed to get from this? Like, and I have basic questions that I cannot answer based on just a big table of numbers. And even tables, though, they're not neutral, right? The way that you organize them, the way that you aggregate the data, if you choose to show totals or subtotals, like all of these are design choices that affect how people perceive the data. So even from that perspective, tables are not neutral. And so, and even actually, you can even take a step further. Raw data, right? Columns and rows isn't even neutral because people made subjective decisions about what data to collect in the first place, and how to organize it, how to filter it. And so, you kind of have to accept that data and charts always have a purpose, a reason, right? And so my own view is like, just tell users this is, like I put, I have this sort of handwritten font that I use all the time that I put into charts, which basically says, this is what I think this is going to mean to you, essentially, and why it's important, and maybe even some suggestions about what to do about it, how to respond. To me, that's adding real value, essentially. And if you don't do that, then you're forcing the audience to essentially guess why you thought they should see the data.
Yeah. No, but everybody likes a good guess and check. Thank you for that. And this is from Brad. Brad wants to know if you have any guidance on how to make a chart look good and attractive, but at the same time be accessibility compliant. He's been adding source data to reports to ensure accessibility.
Yeah, I'll be honest. This is something which I'm in the process of educating myself about, right? And so, because I know like the things that a lot of people know in terms of choosing color palettes that are friendly to colorblind users, but I know enough to know that it goes well beyond that. You have to also look at things like contrast and font sizes, for example. And so, and there are often trade-offs, as was kind of implied in the question, that if you make a chart more accessible, you're also going to make it kind of uglier, right? And maybe even a little bit less intuitive, because, for example, you can't use red and green, because with the most common forms of color blindness, people perceive those color, they can't distinguish between those colors, right? And so then we're using things like blue and orange, which aren't quite as obviously representative of like good and bad. And so, I mean, as a general rule, what I recommend is, if you have the time, if you have the resources, produce two versions of the chart, right? There's the accessible one, and then there's the kind of the regular one, essentially. And that then gives you the best of both worlds. And so if it's on a website or something, maybe there's a toggle which says, okay, go into accessibility mode. And then, you show the versions of the charts which are, there's going to be some compromises there, at a minimum, sort of aesthetic and possibly even functional. But at least people who have accessibility challenges can get, something. And then you also have kind of the regular version for people who don't have those accessibility challenges, if you have the time.
Yeah. And then Matthias actually has a follow-up question to the previous question you had answered about, I think it was kind of about readability within the chart and understanding what the chart was presenting. But should a dashboard have a message that's almost like a headline?
Okay, so dashboards are actually kind of a different animal, right? The two main courses that I teach are about, there's practical charts about data visualization, and there's practical dashboards, which are about dashboards. dashboards have, like I said, this whole other set of new challenges that we typically don't have to worry about if we're just producing a single chart. And so if and dashboard also has a lot of baggage and issues around what it means to different people. And so if by dashboard you mean essentially just a chart, essentially a static chart, or maybe a couple of charts like on a slide or a poster or something, then yeah, headline, call outs, be explicit. This is why I think you need to see this information. And if you have suggestions about how the audience should respond to it, absolutely. Like I said, a lot of people think, oh, well, that's not my role if I'm a data analyst. No. Like, I think you're going to be a lot more valuable to your audience if you actually take those next steps and put some interpretation in the chart. Because like I said, your interpretation is there anyways, whether you want it to be or not. That drove all of your design decisions to even get to that chart in the first place. And so I don't think, as long as you're being honest, right, you have the best interest of the audience at heart, right? You're not trying to manipulate them or steer them or misrepresent the information or something like that. When it comes to dashboards, there's, in my course, I actually I segment dashboards into 8 different types of dashboards that have profoundly different purposes, right? Like I said, dashboard is kind of a terrible word because it's pretty much used to describe, any display with a bunch of charts on it, but there's a lot of different types of those that serve very different purposes. And so if we're talking about, for example, a dashboard that is used for status monitoring, well, that's always answering the same question, which is essentially, is everything okay? And does anything require my attention at the moment? Which, by the way, is by far the hardest question to answer in any organization, because the number of things that could be going wrong is usually in the tens of thousands, right? If you're a retailer, you have, you sell, 15,000 products online or something. Each one of those 15,000 products has like 20 metrics associated with it, sales in dollars, sales in units, return rate, discount rate, all that. Okay, well, right away, we just got to 250,000 or something, just like that. And then there's all the other metrics for the business too. And so I actually spend about half, so 7 hours of that dashboard course just talking about how do we do that. It's not easy, but it is possible to actually design dashboards that do that. In that case, of course, you're not putting any kind of interpretation in there. You're just essentially trying to detect and flag issues that require attention and bring them up onto the dashboard so that users can notice them, first of all, and then respond appropriately to them. And so really, coming back to the original question, it does depend a lot on the kind of dashboard you're talking about. If it's more that something that's almost like an infographic, yes, headline, interpretation, whatever. Status monitoring dashboards, no, you wouldn't want to put a headline on there.
Okay, so this next question is from Jorge. Jorge would like to know, what's the best open source tool to work with charts? I feel like that's a very opinionated question, but Nick, what is your favorite open source tool for charts?
I have to be kind of careful because I am an independent educator. I'm not associated with any particular products. I have relationships with all the major vendors. I speak at their conferences and I've written articles for their publications and whatnot. And so, but in all honesty, I would not be able to recommend a single tool because, as I was just talking about, right, charts and dashboards can serve all sorts of different purposes. There's actually maybe Fatima, if you can just Google search or just go to, there's a website called mapofdatavisualization.com, or I guess people can type into their browser themselves. Because a couple of months ago, I basically took a crack at trying to sort of organize all these things that we call charts and dashboards and reports into some kind of sort of manageable kind of taxonomy, right? And so ultimately, it depends really. Like that's almost always what it comes down to. So Fatima has put up a link there. So if you click on that, you'll see that a lot of the answers to these questions, in terms of like what is the best tool, for example, is going to depend on which part of the map you're working in, right? And so, and actually in that map, I name a couple of examples of tools. Like I say, so if you're working on this kind of chart, more kind of, let's say, infographic-y sort of thing, well, then you're going to be using tools like Adobe Illustrator. But then if you're doing more sort of like scientific visualization, well, then you're going to be probably using tools like Jump, for example. If you're doing very sort of customized, non-standard charts, well, then you're going to be using things like D3, right? And so I can't recommend a single tool because it very much depends on what kind of chart or what kind of dashboard you're actually making.
Okay. So next question is more about dashboarding. This person wanted to hear your thoughts on self-service dashboards, how to approach them differently than when you are creating charts for actionable insights.
Yeah, another good question. So one of the 8 types of dashboards that I talk about in my dashboard course is essentially kind of self-serve analysis dashboards. And again, the way that you go about designing those is very different than for like a status monitoring dashboard or more something that's more like an infographic, for example. And I guess you got to be really careful with these because if you listen to the marketing, materials from vendors, of course, for the last couple of years, it's been a super kind of hot topic, right? Our product is so smart, you just put it in the hands of any monkey, and all of a sudden they're a data analyst. And this, I think, is very dangerous and irresponsible, right? In my talk, I mentioned a few of these kind of statistical landmines that you can sort of step on if you're not aware of them. Well, you can do that with these self-serve tools as well, right? If you don't understand the difference between causation or correlation, if you don't understand the difference between means and medians, you're going to come up with insights that look very correct and very normal that are absolutely false, right, and wrong. And so does that mean that, we shouldn't put any tools in the hands of like untrained analysts or statisticians? No, because, users who don't have that training can answer certain classes of questions on their own. Like, for example, pretty sort of simple kind of querying questions. Oh, I just need a list of customers who've bought things from us in the last 6 months using a credit card, and the transaction was more than $100. Okay, you don't have to be a trained analyst or statistician to get that. You can give them a tool where they can get those kinds of answers themselves. But if their question is something like, why has customer satisfaction been declining recently? Like, whoa, okay. The answer to that is probably going to be a lot more complicated. There's a lot more potential to step on those statistical and reasoning kind of landmines. And so it's that, okay, that one we're going to have to pass that on to the data team, to somebody who has sufficient training to actually handle that. And so I wish there was more kind of nuance in the marketing around these self-serve tools. We say, okay, yes, there are self-serve tools which can be used by untrained, non-statistician, non-analysts, but then there's these other classes of questions and tools where you should really have some training, because otherwise you're going to, shoot yourself in the foot, almost certainly, which can be very costly.
Okay. And this next question kind of goes back to that, the first question about having a message or a headline on a dashboard. What about doing something similar, like having a message for an individual chart?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, like I said, I'm all for putting essentially your interpretation of the data into charts, right? It could be a headline, it could be the title, it could be as a call out or as a note underneath. But yeah, like you want to be highlighting things in the chart, saying this is the most important part of the chart, right? And in the bar chart, there's 2 bars that are darker, right? They're all blue. 2 of them are darker blue, because these are the ones that I think you need to be paying attention to. And, and this is why. Like, explain it. Well, because this is, we thought this one thing was going to happen, but actually it turned out that something else was going to happen. And that's why I think you need to be aware of this, right? And so there's kind of a, one of the things I talk about in my course is a sort of a hierarchy of interpretation, right? Like, you can have the most basic level of interpretation, which is essentially, I just found something, I think this is important to you, but then you can step up to the next level, which is trying to explain it, right? I found this thing and I have some theories, I have some ideas as to why it happened, right? Why did sales go down? That's useful. That's helpful to the audience. They might not agree with it, but, chances are they probably will, right? You probably, because you handle the data, you probably know more than they do about that particular topic. And then the next level up is what you should do about it. And this is going to depend on the situation, right? Sometimes this is appropriate, sometimes it's not. But oftentimes people are very hesitant. Like, even if they have something in mind saying, I think, so this problem that I pointed out and that I explained, I also have some ideas about maybe what we could do about it. I have 3 suggestions or whatever. And so, I encourage people in my workshops, like, no, put those in, right? They don't have to take your suggestions, but they'll probably appreciate them. Yeah.
Okay. And then this will be, I think, our last question. I think it'll be the only, because we're coming up here on the hour and it is Friday, so we don't want to hold anybody too late. So where'd it go? There we are. And I don't quite understand this, so I'm going to read it to you, and I'm hoping it clicks for you.
Okay.
So if data are not neutral, where does the true data live?
Okay, I think I understand, what the sort of the core of the question is. So yeah, essentially I guess it is kind of philosophical, but like, sort of, is there any truth? This kind of thing. There's a famous axiom by statistician George Box said in the 70s, which essentially, like, all statistical models are wrong, but some are useful. And that's kind of the way I think about data and charts as well, right? Data is always imperfect because even a very rich, detailed data set only captures a tiny, tiny, tiny slice of reality, right? And so, we're basically, even if, like I said, we capture every click on our website, on our, every transaction, it's very rich, very detailed. There's still a million things that are happening, like the user is, dog is barking at them. And so that's why they're clicking in the wrong place. And it's like, well, that's not in our data set, right? And so, really the goal is essentially, I don't think the goal is truth when we're creating, collecting data, creating charts. It's usefulness, right? And so in order to be useful, though, we have to avoid misrepresenting the data or misrepresenting reality, right? Of course. But to think that somehow we are going to fully and completely objectively capture reality in a chart is not realistic, right? Reality is so infinitely more complex than we could ever show in any chart, that any chart is going to be essentially just an interpretation of some aspect of reality. And so really the best we can hope to do is, like I said, have a useful chart. So useful, if you kind of unpack that, means that it is our best interpretation of that reality in the best interest of the user, right? We're not trying to deceive them. We're not trying to manipulate them. We're trying to help them. And so as long as you check those boxes, I think that is the gold standard. That is the best you will ever be able to do. You will never be able to show reality. Yeah. So that got very philosophical.
Yeah,
really great question.
We're ending it on a brain teaser. So thank you so much, Nick, for being here with us today. We really appreciate it. Just a reminder.